Welcome to the Bad Roman Podcast. On this show, we talk with veterans, community leaders, Christians and non-Christians as we explore the entanglement of Christians with the state. The Bad Roman Project was created out of the firm belief that as Christians, we are called to follow Christ, not the state. Here is your host, Craig Hargis.
Hey folks, we're going to try something a little different. I have been a huge advocate of promoting other projects on our platform and decided to do a series with other podcasters. Today, Matt of Expedition 44 joined me to tell us all about their project. And honestly, their podcast is one I have latched onto personally because the content is something we should all consider.
Would rather serve God than serve Caesar, you feel me? Right. I'm just trying to live what he said. I'm just trying to live what he said. I ain't scared, I will take one to the head. Go ahead. So it's safe to say that I'm bad. So it's safe to say that I'm bad. So it's safe to say that I'm bad.
Matt, how are you doing?
Hey, how's it going, Craig? Thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor to talk with you.
Yeah, man, same here. I've been listening to y'all's podcasts. I think you reached out to me when you started listening to ours, and you were thanking me for the stuff we're doing, and you enjoy the podcast. And then you mentioned just having a podcast. I was like, well, what is it? Well, what's your podcast? You told me what it was, and I started listening to it. I listened to it quite a bit when I'm at the gym, and I like the stuff you guys are talking about. You know, there's a lot of things that you guys are mentioning on that show that you're not hearing even in church these days. And so give us a little background of yourself before we get into this. And I'm going to ask you what possessed you to start a podcast, because after everything you see with the podcast, what goes into it, you know, there's a lot of work that goes into this, but give us a little background of yourself.
Yeah. So, well, my name is Matt. I live in Wisconsin, and I'm a worship pastor at a non-denominational church. You and I were talking the other day. It's, I guess, if you were to flavor it, it would be kind of mix of Baptist and Pentecostal. So Baptist-costal. So, which is very, very, I guess, even evangelical. I know you grew up, or your tradition is Southern Baptist and that. So it may remind you of your earlier life in Christianity. Yeah. So I'm a father of 4, been married to my wife for 16 years. Love music, a theology geek. I'm working on my doctorate in New Testament right now. Maybe by the time this is published, maybe I'll have that. I'm right at the end. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I hope it's not a train. But that's kind of a little bit about me. So Expedition 44 is the name of the podcast that I co-host, and I actually didn't start it. My co-host Ryan, he wasn't able to join us today. His kid's soccer game or something got changed around, and we have a discipleship event that we're doing tonight. And so the stars didn't align for him to come on here, but he's the one who actually founded it. And Ryan is he's the head chair of biblical studies and theology at Covenant Theological Seminary in Greenfield, North Carolina, I believe it is. And that's where I'm getting my THD through as well. So he's my doctoral supervisor, but he started the podcast, and then he came to one of the Bible studies I was doing at church and liked the content of what I was teaching. And he invited me, and we had been friends for a while. Like our kids play together. My wife and his wife are good friends. And so he and I have known of each other and hung out quite a bit. And so he invited me to come on and do an episode with him, and kind of that's where it went from there. He and I have been doing episodes together for about 2.5 years, I believe. Yeah, it started out as a YouTube, specifically YouTube, and that's where a bigger following that we have is. But I kind of took on putting it in audio form, just putting the audio out on basically any podcast app that you can listen on, Spotify, Apple, Google, whatever. After that. So yeah, we like our big mantra is that we don't like to leave any rock unturned as we do we just do Bible studies on going through books, doing topical stuff, and just seeing like, what does the Bible say for itself in its own culture. Both he and I are huge into the ancient context of what did this mean to the original audience, and how can we interpret that today?
Now, let me ask you about the name Expedition 44 before we go, get into some of those topics. I'm really kind of curious, and I've had people, Talia, who's joined the project to work on as an assistant to our producer, and she was really kind of curious about the name. You sent me y'all's website the other day, and you actually just told me about it before I even had a chance to ask you. So tell us a little bit about what that means. What is Expedition 44? Where did y'all come up with that from?
Yeah, so this is actually kind of Ryan, the co-host. He kind of initially came up with this, but it kind of means a lot to both of us. And well, an expedition is a journey, and we believe that salvation, contrary to what it's usually framed as in the evangelical culture, is just a moment or a decision. It's an entire journey, and it's a way of life. So that's kind of where it's framed at. Now, the 44 thing is interesting because there's a lot of instances, and I guess ways that this connects back in the Bible. Specifically, like if you go and look at intertestamental literature, the writings between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's this group called the Essenes, which is the Dead Sea Scroll community, and they called themselves the Sons of Light and gave themselves the number 22. And they were the ones who saw that all the Jews were entangled in society and entangled with the Romans and entangled with the improper worship in the temple. And so they separated themselves from society. I mean, not completely, like that they weren't going to participate in stuff, but from the mindset and the systems of the world, they saw that they were separate, and they called themselves the Sons of Light. They gave themselves the number 22. There's also a concept in the Bible of a double portion. So it's when you bring your gifts, when you bring what you have to the Lord, lay it on the altar, and he does innumerably more with it than what you could yourself. And so we're asking God that for our set apartness to take on a double portion. That's 44.
That's very cool. That's very cool.
And there's tons of 44s in the Bible. Like Ryan, he rebuilds 4x4 Jeeps. I have 4 kids. He has 4 kids. So it kind of is kind of cool. So that's it. And it's a whole mindset of being all in disciples for Jesus. Yeah, that's the Expedition 44 mindset.
So what happens if y'all have another kid?
I don't think that's going to happen to either of us. We're both fixed.
Okay. Didn't mean to get personal.
It's all good.
It's like, do we change it from Expedition 44 to 55?
No, 45 or 54.
Or 45 or 46, or we just keep ratcheting up the number? That's funny.
No, we do have, my wife and I host foreign exchange students each year. And so we do kind of have 5 kids, even though they're not.
There you go. We got to change the name now. It's Expedition 45 now.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to get into or talk to you about. One of y'all's episodes was on the Church of Nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a hot topic that we talk about quite a bit on the Bad Roman podcast. Okay, and it's because it's something. It's a source of frustration for me personally when talking with pastors who cannot seem to get this. I've even had pastors tell me, "Yes, you're right, but I can't say that in church." I don't want to hear that. That's when I become more frustrated. Why can't you say it in church? Because you're afraid to drive down the numbers. You're afraid to have empty seats in your church. Man, that really grinds my gears. I can't tell you how much it grinds my gears. But I was listening to this episode, and I told you this. What's his name? Steve, the guy you were having a discussion with?
Yeah. Pastor Steve Castle.
Okay. Great guy. Sounds like a great guy all around. And I thought you did very well in this discussion. And I told you some of the stuff he was saying sounded very familiar to me from stuff I've heard from other pastors. And so it was if he listens to this, don't take this the wrong way, but a lot of what he was saying was very cringy to me because I've heard so much of it from, your average American pastor. I mean, we see it so much in this country when it comes to the entanglement of the Christian with the state.
Yep.
And pastors, in my opinion, should be taking the lead behind the pulpit and talking about this, and saying, listen, there's no king but Christ, but it's not happening. A lot of pastors get behind a pulpit and advocating for one candidate or another, depending on which side they come from. And this not There's nothing about that in the Bible. There's nothing about that. There's no evidence from that from the early church. And matter of fact, if you take the early church very seriously and read the stuff very seriously, you see very quickly that they had no interest in the Roman Empire. They wanted nothing to do with it. You go read the works of Origen or Tertullian.
Mm-hmm.
They were very outspoken about the Roman Empire and how, and Tertullian said, I say this all the time, the affairs of the state is completely foreign to us.
Yeah.
I will not take part in your meetings. I'm not an occupier of the voting booth. And then, there's all this stuff from the early church, and it's just glossed over these days. And once that the entanglement happened with Constantine, the image of the church changed, in my opinion. You can see it changed, and they're so corrupted, and it's just gotten worse. And people are, a lot of churches are trying to seek power through the state. Why? I want to talk about that episode a little bit, because what started the conversation? Why did y'all want to have this conversation? Because y'all were coming at it from two different angles.
Yeah. Steve is actually a good friend of mine. He's connected to Expedition 44. If you go back in kind of our archives, he's been on quite a few episodes, and I think he has a pretty decent theological foundation. He's like, over the years I've known him, he's grown a ton there, and he's a great guy. I mean, the guy's just on fire for Jesus. So I'm not going to say anything bad about him or his character at all. I disagree with him on the way that he approaches nationalism, especially with Christianity, because I completely agree with you. There's no basis in the Bible for a Christian to be entangled with the state, or be seeking power, or any of that. It's just baseless when it comes to a reading of Scripture that you and I hold to, that Christ is our King. There's no king but Christ. That's kind of our mantra on Expedition 44 as well, is that there's no king but Christ. And we're not completely just a podcast about politics, but politics comes into your theology so much. And so we do comment on it a lot throughout any of our episodes. You'll hear us make political jabs against the people that are entangled with the state. Yeah, so with Steve, our conversation was more that Ryan, who's the host, he's been great friends with Steve for a while, and I've met Pastor Steve, through Ryan. And Ryan wanted to say, hey, let's have a conversation about these things, and just having a conversation. It wasn't a debate. And so he just asked, like, all right, so let's hear two sides of the story, kind of, is what it was. Because, like, yeah, Steve's on fire. Like, he's on fire for Jesus. So am I. We both claim that Christ is our king, but we have different views when it comes to the state. And so that's kind of the whole view of that. And yeah, I would say that Steve does sound like a lot of the modern pastors these days who are just very, very entangled. Seeing that, I think the big thing that came out in that conversation is that, that was Rome back then, and they were under like a king, but we have representative government today.
They just didn't call them presidents back then. I mean, it's you can change the title, but it's still the same concept. It's the same thing. When, like in 1 Samuel 8, when Israel's demanded a king. I've had this conversation with folks too. When I would bring up 1 Samuel 8, they're like, "We don't even have king today." Mm-hmm. I said, "Yes." Okay, they weren't back in 1 Samuel 8 demanding a president. Yeah, they were demanding a king, which is the same thing when you go to the voting booth demanding a king. It's the same thing. Yeah, they just use this. It's just different words. I mean, but it's the same concept.
Yeah, so it comes down to the issue of authority. Where in the Bible, like Ryan and I always say, like one of our other mantras on our podcast is it begins with Eden and it ends with Eden. And on the first 2 pages of the Bible and the last 2 pages of the Bible is where you find God's ideals. Everything in the middle is messed up.
I love that. I've never looked at it that way. I never even heard it put that way, but I love that.
Yeah, so you have on day 6, God creates humankind to be in his image. In the ancient world, one who imaged the God was the king. But here's the thing, man and women are both the image of God, so it's equality. Neither one has authority over each other. They're given authority over the creatures and the earth and the plants, and that's what they're given authority over. So humans aren't supposed to have authority over each other. Even when Eve is made out of Adam in Genesis 2, out of the side, most say rib. That's a horrible translation. I would say it's side. It's salah, which always in the Old Testament refers to like one side of the Ark of the Covenant versus the other, one side of the temple versus the other, one side of a hill versus the other. It's almost like God cut Adam in half and made Eve. They're two parts of one whole. Huh. So there's no authority there.
Yeah, you mentioned my Southern Baptist upbringing or time in Southern Baptist. I always heard that about the rib.
Yeah, no, it's horrible. Like it's not a bad translation of the Hebrew because it is the side. And like if God wanted Adam to be the authority, wouldn't he have like maybe made Eve out of his feet or something like that? But instead it's out of his side. So humans aren't supposed to have authority over other humans. They're supposed to work together and rule and reign creation as God's ambassadors.
I like that.
Yeah. The last pages of the Bible, you see the same thing. You see us under God, and that was the same thing. Like men and women under God in Eden. At the end, it's all of humanity under the Lamb.
So everything in between's messed up. I love that.
Yep. It's not God's ideal. We should look at Genesis 1 and 2 and the end of Revelation as God's ideals. And that should also inform our politics.
Right. And you said that a while ago, too, that, y'all's podcast doesn't focus a lot on, all the time on politics, but it does come into the discussion. It's something that I've had conversations with folks on this show before. We're going to be outspoken about the empire, but it doesn't mean we participate in the empire.
Yeah.
We're not ignorant to the fact that it exists. We're not ignorant to the fact that it's oppressive, and we're going to have a very strong opinion about it. But it does not mean we support it or get entangled with it, and get involved with it because we already have a king. We're not an American. We're a Christian, we're a follower of Christ. We're just passing through. We're just ambassadors from another kingdom.
Yeah,
we are. That's the way we should look at the United States government, or Australia, or Germany, or Canada, wherever you are at in this world, listening to this podcast right now. That's how you should view the government in your country. That's their kingdom. You already belong to a totally different kingdom, and it's a best kingdom that we can imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing that you can look at is in Genesis 3, when the whole thing in Genesis 3 after I would say, rather than the fall, the defilement of creation is the way I like to see it more, because there's multiple falls. If you read the Old Testament, they're falling on every other page. But the defilement, the original defilement of creation, the consequences of that, and it's not God necessarily cursing the humans, the ground is being cursed, but he's saying that what happens when you go this way, when you usurp God's authority and you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is it resulted in men ruling over women. That wasn't God's ideal. That was the consequence of the defilement. That wasn't God's ideal in Genesis 1 and 2. And so when we have humans ruling over other humans, it's part of the defilement, not part of God's ideals.
That topic gets people up in arms sometimes, when you talk about...
We have a whole series on women in ministry, and Ryan and I are both very pro women in ministry and using their gifts in the church.
You know what? I'm sad that Ryan's on here because I'd like to really kind of get on that topic a little bit. Maybe I can just get y'all back on and we can talk about it now, because since we're just talking about Expedition 44 and what y'all talk about, let's talk about that a little bit while I got you. You brought it up. Let's talk about that, because that topic right there is something that I debate the entanglement with the state with folks, and this idea that women should not be doing anything in the church, or they should be quiet in church and stuff. And this really frustrates people for some reason when I bring it up. It's a point that I made. I don't know if it was right after Easter or what, but it was not men who Jesus sent to tell the others of the good news of his resurrection. He sent women because all the men were hiding.
Yeah.
Why are we not talking about that?
Yeah.
The idea that women should not have a voice in the church is mad. I used to believe that garbage. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe sometimes I wonder if it's a mistranslation of what Paul was talking about in the New Testament, or maybe just Paul got it wrong. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Let's talk about it a little bit.
I don't think Paul got it wrong. I think Paul is very egalitarian. I do think he is. And so a lot of my focus of my studies is on Paul. And so part of what I think the big confusion is not looking at the Bible through, like I said, the ideals are the bookmarks of the Bible, the ends, the beginning and the end is what God's ideal is, and what we see in Jesus. So if in Genesis 3 in the subjugation of women or whatever, or however you want to read that text there, is reversed in Jesus, then how should we live if we are kingdom cells and recreated humans like here now? Our church should be a reflection of here and now, the kingdom of God on earth. And if that was part of the fall or the defilement, then why would we want to keep part of the defilement in our churches? That's the whole question. So I think the big text that always gets thrown out is 1 Timothy chapter 2, where it talks about I do not permit a woman to speak in church or whatever, to have authority over men. I don't have the text right here in front of me, but I've talked about this enough that I can spout it off kind of the top of my head. And that's what a lot of people be like, oh, well, see there, that's Paul saying that women can't lead, women can't teach, women can't do this, that, or the other in the church. And it's completely wrong. You have to look at the whole letter of 1 Timothy as a whole. 1 Timothy, I believe it's chapter 1, verse 7, talks about the whole issue that he's writing is about false teaching in the church. So the false teaching that is myths and endless genealogies. If you look at the historical context of Artemis there, they had basically an all-woman cult there and so the women were used to leading because of that. But what if they're being converted into Christianity and they still have this worldly mindset coming into the church? And actually, no one should have authority over anybody in the church. Because right before this, Paul yells at the men for being angry. And then he goes and talks to the women next. So Paul's an equal opportunity offender in the text. And so what he's saying there is that at this time, if you look at the Greek grammar, when he says, I do not permit a woman to teach in church, it's not a command in Greek. So what he is saying, there is one command in the text, and that is that a woman must learn. And so what's the posture of a student? Someone who's quiet and submissive, right? And so he's saying basically the whole point of 1 Timothy 2 is that the women are being converted into Christianity, maybe from a pagan background, and they're trying to basically teach before they've learned. You shouldn't teach before you've learned, right? I mean, that's common sense. And so that's the whole thing there. So he's saying, I do not permit at this time is what I believe a better translation is, because it's not in the perfect tense in Greek, which would mean from now to forever. Like when Jesus says it is finished on the cross, that's in perfect tense. Like it's a noun for everything. So one, it's not a command. Two, it's not an ongoing thing in the Greek grammar. And so what Paul is saying is that, hey, the women, you need to learn before you teach. And that's the whole context of it there.
Now, you're familiar with Keith Giles. Y'all have had him on y'all's show as well. And he talks about this stuff quite a bit. He lays it out. He's got an episode. I think it's one of his. It sounds like he's got 100 different podcasts that he's doing, but it's one of the Second Cup with Keith, I think is what it's called. And he's got an episode on there about this topic, and he just lays it all out. Mm-hmm. And he shows proof after proof after proof of women leading in the church, or not. Maybe leading is the wrong word, but being teachers in the church, participating in the church. So it really conflicts with the way people understand what Paul was saying, and you just laid it out right there too. This is actually what Paul's talking about. Yeah,
and then 1 Corinthians 14 is the other one, and where it says that basically women be quiet in church and go home and ask your husbands, basically. I mean, the thing is that women in the ancient world needed to be caught up because of that time in society. Women weren't as educated as men. Women stayed home at that time. So Paul's not saying women, you can't teach. Now, the thing is, like, if it was giving a message and people kept interrupting in church, that would hinder the learning of the rest of the body, right? And so what he's saying is, wives, I do want you to learn, don't interrupt. The other thing is that whole context there, those couple verses in 1 Corinthians 14, if you want to get really geeky with it, appear in a whole bunch of different spots in Romans 14 in different manuscripts. So some think it could be a scribal error or scribal writing in the column that made it into the text.
Really?
Philip Payne, in his book, Men and Women, One in Christ, has about 30 to 50 pages on this, where he was hands-on with the manuscripts.
Huh.
We have a whole episode on it in our Women in Ministry series.
Hey folks, Craig here, and I'd like to let y'all know we are always looking for writers to contribute to our blog. I don't care if you have any experience or not. 2 or 3 of our contributors had no prior experience writing, and it turns out they have a real knack for it. Our project coordinator helps them put the articles together, and she publishes them on our website and Facebook page, and you will also have the option to come on the show and go more in depth about your article. So if you like what we're doing at The Bad Roman and would like to try your hand at writing, then send us an email at thebadromanpodcast@gmail.com. We're having a blast with this project, and we would love for you to join us in helping promote it. Now back to the show.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit. You sent me a couple of pieces the other day from y'all's website that Ryan wrote, right?
Yeah.
One was on voting and one was on Romans 13. All right, we've kind of covered voting a little bit earlier in the show. You want to talk about Romans 13 a little bit while I got you?
Yeah, why not? I'm writing my dissertation on it.
Okay, there we go. Perfect. So when you read Romans 13, this is something that is used all the time when we're saying no king but Christ, and they use Romans 13. That's always the first go-to, right? Like you can see it coming from a mile away.
Oh, yeah.
Why don't you lay it down the way you see Romans 13 for anybody on the fence right now, listening right now? When you see Romans 13, because I've got my idea about it, how I view it, because to me, the words submit and obey are 2 different words. And if you look at the 2 words in the Greek, they're 2 different words. There's 2 different definitions. And so in Romans 13, when it says submit, and then in Acts 5, it says obey. Okay, that's the way I see it. That's when we first started this project, and when I was really trying to, because I kept getting hit with Romans 13. So I really had to dig into it to see, like, what is going on here? Why do they keep using that? And I just had to pin down those 2 words right there and see that there's a difference here. Oh, now it makes sense to me. Now I can explain this better. But why don't you lay it out for us and tell us what you think is going on there with Romans 13?
Yeah, I'm going to pull it up here on my phone quick as we're going through it. But I would say that Romans 13 needs to be read in light of Romans 12.
Right.
So, and that's one thing that a lot of people miss is, the chapter breaks and everything weren't put in until centuries later. So they would have read this as a full flowing document. Romans is divided up. Paul has a couple different discourses where you can see natural breaks in it. So like Romans 1 through 3 and maybe 4 in there, and then 5 through 8, and then 9 through 11 is a different chunk there. And then he has 12 through 16 in Romans. And all of those sections need to be read as literary units. And it's not just chapter by chapter, verse by verse thing. That's the whole context of it. So when it says, going off of that, like basically in Romans chapter 12, I think it's 17, verse 17 on, basically Paul's recapping the Sermon on the Mount. He's giving a whole recap of the Sermon on the Mount, which is obviously those are our marching orders, the words of Jesus, right, as Christians. So we need to see, can this line up with the Sermon on the Mount, the love your neighbor as yourself, to turn the other cheek, to leave vengeance to God, to go the extra mile, all of those things that Jesus said about loving our enemy. How does that fit into Romans 13? Because they can't contradict. Like Paul's not contradicting himself 5 sentences later. So I would say you're absolutely right. When it says to submit to, and it says governing authorities there, I'll get to that in a minute. But submit, like you said, hypotassesthō is the Greek word, which means submit. And I believe submit, and I can back this up, you can look elsewhere too, it's voluntary yielding is the way I define it. Like, it's your voluntarism. But hupakaio means obey, and that's not in the text. Hupakaio is only used in the Bible toward God. We obey God.
I don't know if I've mentioned this to you in our conversations on the phone or in messaging. Are you familiar with David Bentley Hart?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I got his New Testament translation.
Yep.
And this may not mean anything to folks, but it meant so much to me when I went to Acts 5, because I just wanted to see how he put it, how he translated it. We read Acts 5 where it says, we ought to obey God rather than man, or we are to obey God rather than man, depending on which translation. Mm-hmm. In this translation, it says it is necessary that we obey God rather than man. That one word necessary, like it was a punch in the face to me, like it just hit me. Just that one word. And that, like I said, that might not mean anything to anybody else, but that one word for some reason just really highlighted the entire verse. I already believed it. I believed what it said. Yeah. But that word necessary for some reason changed it. It made it even more, made it stronger for me than what it said prior to what we're used to reading.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes it a whole lot stronger based on how you translate it that way. But I would say that's a very accurate translation. I mean, obviously David Bentley Hart is way better at Greek than me. But
I like what you said about Romans 13, that you have to read it in light of Romans 12. Mm-hmm. When they drop the Romans 13 argument, they read the first 7 verses Romans 13, and then they go away. They don't continue reading. They didn't read prior to the first 7 verses of Romans 13. It reminds me of the same argument about using a gun for self-defense. That this is the argument I get from folks too. Is like, well, Jesus said, buy a sword. Yeah, he did say that. You're correct. He did say that. But why did he say that? Are you going to continue reading? He said, buy a sword. That means I should go buy a 9mm and carry it around with me, defending myself. That's not what he was saying. Because what happened when Peter cut the Roman soldier's ear off?
Jesus healed him right away and said, put it away.
Healed him. Yeah. He didn't say use it like that. I mean, I don't understand that. I think that's why there's so much confusion among Christians when it comes to the Bible, because it's like you pick and choose what you want to use in the Bible to fit your narrative, and you're not reading the thing as a whole. Mm-hmm. It's not like Paul was walking around saying, using the verses of Romans 13, 1-7, and then he just stopped talking all of a sudden.
Yep. No.
And it's not like that's the first time he ever said anything. Read before Romans 13.
Yep.
Read what Jesus was saying when he said, buy a sword. Why did he say buy a sword? And there's another argument. Well, what did Jesus do whenever he went into the temple? He was using a whip. I said, did he hit anybody with that whip? There's no evidence. And a matter of fact, Jason Porterfield lays this out great in his book, where he says he wasn't even chasing human beings. He was chasing animals out of the temple.
Yeah, the whip was a common tool by the shepherds to drive animals.
Yes.
The text doesn't even say he hit the animals.
Right. And he said, and Jason was talking about in that episode when Abby was helping. He said, if you look at what this actual whip was, he said, I made one. I ordered the materials. I made it. He said, my children were laughing at me, thinking that's not a whip. They got this. You see these images of Jesus chasing people with a whip and turning over the tables. I said, yeah, he got angry, but he got angry without sinning. He got angry without hitting anybody with that whip, or actually, shooting somebody or cutting somebody's ear off. It's a difference.
He got angry about the extortion.
Right. I mean, if you look at the way Jason was talking about it in that episode, he said you had one side of the temple that was set up for the Jews and the other side was set up for the Gentiles. Well, the Jews had turned the Gentile side into a barn, basically. It was full of animals. Mm-hmm. And Jesus was like, I'm not going to have any of this garbage. And he started chasing the animals out of it. That's one thing that gets so frustrating for me when you're talking to folks. It's like, just keep reading. Where did you go? How did you come to this conclusion? Because somebody behind a pulpit told you, or your fellow churchgoer told you this, or did you read it yourself? Did you take it all into context? What is actually happening here? And they're not. That's another thing that I wish Christians would get away from, is relying so heavily on somebody behind a pulpit. You have the ability to read this stuff yourself. God gave you the ability to learn these things, learn this stuff yourself. It's going to make more sense to you, because we're human beings. We can lead one another astray if we have false, tenses, or intentions, so come on, man. Back in that day too, that's another thing. A lot of the folks couldn't even read. What was like less than 2% of the population couldn't read. So when they were hearing about Jesus by word of mouth, and they were flocking to him. To tell me that people would not know about Jesus without the Bible, to me, is asinine, because they were hearing about Jesus back then by word of mouth. Are you telling me that we wouldn't be talking about Jesus today if it wasn't for the Bible? I've had that argument so many times from folks too. You wouldn't know anything about Jesus if it wasn't for the Bible. So that's baloney.
Yep.
I heard about Jesus from my grandmother and my mom.
Yep, it's word of mouth.
You know,
I mean, even talks about in 2 Timothy. I mean, Timothy learned everything from his mother and grandmother.
Right.
It's interesting when you dig into the oral tradition stuff.
Come on, guys, we can do better.
Mm-hmm.
We can do better. I mean, you cannot put Jesus in a box or the Bible and just contain him there. There's so much more about it.
Yeah.
And I mean, he said he sent the Comforter, the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
To think that we're not still learning this as we go, somebody's talking to us. You know, I mean, you can read the Bible, and there's a lot of great stuff in the Bible, but there's still, you got a conscience going on. There's somebody talking to you. You know right from wrong. You know if it looks like Jesus or if it doesn't look like Jesus. I mean, he sent you somebody to tell you that. I mean, he's always there, regardless. So, wow, I just went on a tangent. Yeah.
So if we go back to Romans 13, let me pitch another version that maybe we could read this.
Okay.
A lot of like our view of Romans 13, 1-7 revolves around the word governing authorities.
Yes.
And so governing authorities, that word there, yes, it's used in Josephus as the Roman Empire, but it's really just a common word for anyone who has authority. So are they talking about the government, or is he just talking about some other kind of authority? And now in the Roman government, I think the other thing is we need to, like, the Bible was written in a historical context to a historical audience, and what would this word have meant to them is the thing. And so you need to look at like the cultural context of this, and it's written to a people in Rome. And so a few things in this tip me off to think maybe Paul isn't talking about the government, or at least not in the way that we think he's talking about the government. And so I think here, if you look at kind of the historical layout of Rome, and this started in Augustus and was still true at the time that this was written, is there were multiple layers of governmental authority in Rome. Now, Rome was over 1 million people at this time. It was divided up into 4 districts and 250 something neighborhoods, or 14 districts and 250 something neighborhoods, which is interesting. And over each neighborhood, you would have what's called a vico magistrate. They weren't really a governmental authority, but they were somebody placed there by Rome to care for the grain distribution, the fire, and I guess neighborhood watch. It wasn't really policing because you didn't have Roman guards walking through there, and that from what we know, and the upkeep of the neighborhood shrine, which would be kind of to possibly worship the emperor. It wasn't really worship the emperor. It was mainly whoever the patron god of whatever that guild or people, and they would have these conquered people that they would place in these neighborhoods. And so we know of 4 different neighborhoods that the Jews and Christians likely lived in, and they had like maybe conquered Egyptians or something else that would be, or other peoples that would be along with them. And so the other thing is, when Nero took the throne, he eliminated the tribute tax to those who lived in Rome. And so when it talks about taxes later, like, what's he talking about if this is written to a people in Rome and they didn't pay taxes? Because that was tribute from the colonies, or not colonies, but the other conquered nations funded Rome. And so they didn't tax the people that lived in the city of Rome. And we know the letter of Romans is written to people living in Rome. So that changes the whole perspective, doesn't it? When you do it that way.
Let me ask you something, and I've heard this before about Romans 13. It was something that was said to me on our show very early on. I had his name's Kevin Craig. I had him on the show. We did a show about the 4th of July. And we were talking about Romans 13. And he said they understood, and I don't know if it's the governing authorities or there was another word used there, He said they understood that to mean demons back in the day. Have you heard this before? Is that new to you, or is that?
Yeah, the word authorities, and I don't have like my Greek text in front of me, but it's exousia.
Yes,
is what it means, and it's one of Paul's catchphrases for demonic powers that are behind the government.
Okay, so that's not something that I'm making up out of thin air. You've heard this?
No, yeah. If I believe it shows up, and this is just off the top of my head, I don't have it in front of me, so you can check me on this. You all out there listening, I believe it's Ephesians 6 where it says our battle's not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. I believe that word is used there. Romans 8, that nothing can separate us from the love of God, not powers or authorities. That's another one. I think 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where it's talking about the wisdom of God and the wisdom of this world. And it says that basically when we exercise the wisdom of God, that it shows the principalities and powers that they're coming to nothing. I think that's the same word there, like exousia, or at least they're all of those phrases are things that Paul connects together, at least for sure. I know that. And it's all stuff that he believes is the animating power behind empire is the evil principalities and powers, which demons.
Okay, so I mean that ought to open some folks' eyes when you're going to use Romans 13 as your argument, as your defense of voting or being entangled with the empire, because I mean, if they understood it back then as being demons, and I mean, it's not like Jesus told Satan, no, you don't have the authority over the kingdoms of this world. I mean, and when Satan said that should be an eye opener for people running to the polls to vote or run for office and all this stuff, because you're being backed by demons and Satan himself.
Yeah, and this goes back to Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, where Moses is recounting the Tower of Babel, and it says, when God divided up the nations amongst the sons of God, which is the principalities and powers, like he gave each one of them their inheritance, which is the pagan nations, but chose Israel as his own.
Before I let you go, I want to throw something at you real quick that I've been kind of mulling around in my head a little bit when it comes to 1 Samuel 8. And it's something I've had conversations with, privately with other folks a little bit talking about it, because at the time of this recording, we're leading into the midterms in America, right? And so we've been doing a whole series of episodes on voting leading into that, because like, stay away, follow Jesus, no king but Christ, right? When it comes to 1 Samuel 8, I know where I fall down on this. I've come to the conclusion that voting in itself is a sin. Okay. And we can look at it in a couple different ways, because first of all, Jesus said, you see how the Gentiles lord over one another. It will not be the same among you. Okay. And he's talking to us, right? He's not just talking to the Jews. He's talking to all of us that follow him, right? It will not be the same among you. Okay. And in 1 Samuel 8, when Samuel was stressed out over what was going on with the Israelites, when they were demanding a king, God himself said, they didn't reject you, they're rejecting me. Okay. And if rejection of God is not a sin, then I don't know what a sin is anymore. And I don't know if that sounds harsh to folks or not. I don't know how you take that, but that's just where I've come down on it, because, this is Craig talking to Craig. Okay. It's not me saying you should do this because Craig said this. But I don't want to come across that way. It's just where I come down on it. I do a lot of things in my life that is not going to be pleasing in the eyes of God. I'm aware of that. I'm a human being. I'm going to screw up every once in a while, right? I'm still working on some stuff. Now, this one for me is simple. I can stay home on voting day and take a nap. I like to sleep. I'm a huge fan of sleep, okay? I would much rather sleep than go put somebody in power over my neighbor. So this is a very simple sin to avoid, in my opinion. But I don't know I'm kind of curious where you fall down on it. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, if it's uncomfortable, but because it's kind of an uncomfortable conversation for some folks, because they're not used to hearing that kind of stuff. I don't, from what I can tell when I have these conversations, it's like they've never heard this before.
No, I'm totally comfortable talking about this. Actually, tomorrow morning, we're recording tomorrow morning. I don't know when I think it'll be released. Like, obviously, you're releasing this one a little in the future, but it would have been released back by around the midterms. I'm having another discussion with Pastor Steve that Ryan is moderating. It's not a debate, just a discussion. We're all friends. And it's about voting. Like, he's taking the side that Christians should vote. I'm taking the side that Christians shouldn't. So coming to 1 Samuel 8, one of the things that I will be mentioning in that, hopefully, is that basically the exact argument that you made is that, and notice when the elders of Israel come and ask Samuel this, before they've even appointed a king, God is saying it's a rejection of him. So it's the desire to have a king, not necessarily the king itself is the rejection of God. It's the desire to do it, which is interesting. So if we're desiring to have somebody other than God to be our king, that's a sin. And what is voting? The desire to put somebody in power over us, right? The desire to put somebody in power over our neighbor. The desire to have somebody make laws for us that we might not agree with. The desire to put somebody there that's going to lie and cheat and make war and all of this stuff and take lives. I mean, that's a rejection of God. And what is sin itself if it's not a rejection of God?
That's kind of where I come down on it, man. I mean, I just you've listened to the show, so you know that I don't really pull any punches, and I'm pretty outspoken on the things I believe, whether people latch onto it or not. I can't really help that. And I mean, I'm not much of an ear tickler. I would be a horrible pastor, I think, because I get up there to say what you want me to say, because I'm not. I mean, if it means I would have one person in the sanctuary listening to me, then that's probably what's going to happen, because I'm not. So I'm not hesitant. I haven't really talked about it in that aspect on the show until now, but it's because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately when we started doing these episodes about voting and leading into the midterms. And I don't know, man. I sit around and think about this stuff a lot. I got too much time on my hands. Maybe if I get myself busy with some other stuff, I wouldn't think about this stuff so much. But it's something that I couldn't get out of my brain. I kind of wanted to run it by you just to see, because I have a lot of respect for the work you guys are doing. I've really enjoyed listening to Expedition 44. I've started it, with the newer stuff. I haven't made my way back, to some of y'all's older episodes. But guys, folks, if y'all are listening to this and if you've not heard of Expedition 44, go check this podcast out. You will not be disappointed. They have some really good conversations on there that you're going to learn some stuff. And that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to figure this stuff out as we go. And Expedition 44 can certainly help you with that, because they've got it going on over there. I mean, it's a great podcast. Matt, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know you said your family's at a birthday party behind the house, so before they come back and start disrupting you or making noise, why don't I let you get out of here? Why don't you go ahead and plug whatever you want to plug, and then
thanks so much for having on. I mean, expedition44.com is the website. You can look us up on YouTube, just Expedition 44, on all the different podcast apps. Ryan and I are both part of Covenant Theological Seminary. So if you're interested in some higher education, I kind of help build courses there. Ryan's one of he's the head of biblical studies at it. I think it's gocovenant.net right now, but I don't know if they're changing the website or not, but I believe that is it. Other than that, go check out some of the episodes that we talked about here today. I think that we talked about some women in ministry stuff. If you want more on kind of my dissertation in Romans 13 and kind of an alternative view to that, we have an episode, I think it's called Principalities, Powers, and Allegiances, I think it's called, where we go through that whole topic of Romans 13 and kind of seeing that it's more of a conversation about what's going on in the neighborhoods rather than about how to love your neighbor, because that connects to Romans 12 well. Other than that, that's really about all. Ryan, the guy I do the podcast with, Dr. Ryan, he has some books out. One of them is called This is the Way. And he's got another one at this time forthcoming, his second part. And they're just basically on Christian discipleship. And I think he does deal with Christian nationalism in his first book, I know for sure. And it's just more walking the way of Jesus, because our desire at Expedition 44 is to just see people as all in disciples with no king but Christ.
I love it. All right, buddy. I'm going to let you get out of here and go enjoy the rest of your Sunday. It's a nice day out here in Memphis. So I'm going to go enjoy some. I'm going to do some grilling when we get down here. I got some chicken thawed. I've got some ribeyes thawing right now. So I'm going to throw those on the grill and and get ready for some football as well. All right, buddy. I really appreciate this, and we'll have to do this again. I really enjoyed this conversation. Next time we'll get Ryan on with us too. I'd like to pick his brain a little bit as well.
Yeah, it's been incredible, Craig. I really appreciate you, and I've been really enjoying getting to know you, and appreciate all that the Bad Roman is doing. So keep up the good work, man.
I appreciate that. It's one of my favorite aspects of this project is I get to meet people like you that I may have never met before in my life. So it's really kind of cool how we can connect that way. All right, buddy. I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Bad Roman Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts to never miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you like what you heard, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, it really helps people find us. 100% of donations are given to local charities in Memphis, Tennessee. To learn more about the Bad Roman Project and to find show notes, please visit thebadroman.com.